March 15, 2024. The law office of attorney Dr. Henry Santos was as tense as a violin string about to snap. For people sat in leather chairs, avoiding eye contact, waiting for the reading of Eduardo Mendoza's will, a man who had died at 78, leaving behind a fortune worth $2.3 million and a family torn apart by abandonment. Roberto Mendoza, 52, sat in the corner wearing a cheap suit that couldn't hide 15 years of regret etched into his weathered face. He hadn't seen his wife Marina or his children Sophia and Miguel since that cold Tuesday morning in 2009 when he walked out with nothing but a hastily scribbled note. I can't do this anymore. I need to find who I really am. Marina, now 49, sat across the room with her children. Sophia, 23, a brilliant law graduate, and Miguel, 20, a passionate teacher in training. They had built a life without Roberto, a fortress of love and resilience that had no room for the man who had abandoned them when they needed him most. But Eduardo Mendoza, Roberto's father, had been watching from the shadows for 15 years, and the will he left behind wouldn't just distribute his fortune. It would reveal a secret so devastating that it would shatter everything this broken family thought they knew about love, sacrifice, and the man who walked away. What none of them could imagine was that Roberto's abandonment wasn't the story of a selfish man running from responsibility. It was a story of a father who made the most heartbreaking sacrifice imaginable to save his family from a truth that could have destroyed them all. But first, you need to understand how a loving father and husband became the most hated man in his own family story. Roberto and Marina Mendoza had been the couple everyone envied. High school sweethearts who married at 22. They built what seemed like the perfect life in their cozy home on Maple Street. Roberto worked as a successful architect, Marina as a pediatric nurse. Their children, Sophia and Miguel, were bright, happy kids who adored their father. Roberto wasn't just a provider, he was present. He coached Miguel's little league team, helped Sophia with her science projects, and never missed a school play or parent-teacher conference. Sunday mornings meant pancakes made by Dad while Mom slept in. Summer evenings were spent in the backyard, Roberto teaching his children to throw a baseball or showing Sophia how to change a tire. Daddy, will you always be here? 8-year-old Sophia had asked one night as Roberto tucked her into bed. Always, princess. Daddy will never leave you, he had promised, meaning every word. Marina often marveled at how lucky she was. While her friend complained about absent husbands and uninvolved fathers, Roberto was the kind of man who remembered to buy flowers just because it was Tuesday, who planned elaborate birthday parties for the kids, and who still looked at Marina like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Their life wasn't perfect. Roberto worked long hours to provide for his family, sometimes missing dinner or coming home stressed about difficult projects. But their love was unshakable, their commitment to their family absolute. Roberto's father, Eduardo, was enormously proud of his son's life. A self-made millionaire who had built a construction empire from nothing, Eduardo saw in Roberto everything he had hoped for, a man who valued family above all else, who was building something beautiful and lasting. You've got what matters most, mijo, Eduardo would tell Roberto during their weekly dinners. Success means nothing if you don't have family to share it with. But perfect families, as Roberto would learn in the most devastating way possible, can be destroyed by secrets too terrible to bear. Roberto's perfect family was about to face a crisis that would force him to choose between his happiness and their lives. The decision he made would haunt him for 15 years and leave everyone believing he was a monster. The crisis began with a routine doctor's appointment in January 2009. Roberto had been experiencing persistent fatigue and occasional dizzy spells, symptoms he attributed to work stress and long hours. But Dr. Patricia Williams, his longtime physician, insisted on comprehensive blood work after noticing some concerning signs during his examination. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while Roberto was reviewing blueprints in his office. Dr. Williams's voice was gentle but grave. Roberto, I need you to come in immediately. We need to discuss your test results. The diagnosis was acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a particularly aggressive form of blood cancer that, at Roberto's age, had a survival rate of less than 30%. Without immediate and intensive treatment, he had perhaps 6 months to live. With treatment, He might have 2 years, but the chemotherapy would be brutal, expensive, and would likely leave him unable to work. Roberto sat in the doctor's office, absorbing the news as life was entering its final chapter, and all he could think about was Sophia's question from years before. "Will you always be here, Daddy?" He had promised always, but always had just been cut short to maybe 2 years if he was lucky. Dr. Williams explained the treatment protocol. Months of intensive chemotherapy, possible bone marrow transplant, experimental drugs that cost thousands of dollars per dose. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket costs would easily exceed $200,000. The treatment would require Roberto to be hospitalized frequently, making it impossible for him to work and support his family. "What about my family?" Roberto asked, his voice breaking. "How do I tell my children that Daddy is dying? How do I put my wife through watching me waste away while we go bankrupt trying to keep me alive?" Dr. Williams had seen many patients struggle with these questions, but she could see that Roberto was wrestling with something deeper than fear of death. That night, Roberto sat in his car in the hospital parking lot for 3 hours, staring at his phone, unable to drive home and shatter his family's world with the news that would change everything. Sophia was applying to colleges, dreaming of becoming a lawyer like her hero, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Miguel was thriving in high school, passionate about becoming a teacher. Marina was finally pursuing her dream of becoming a nurse practitioner, taking night classes while working full-time. How could he destroy their dreams with his dying? Roberto was about to make a choice that would save his family's future, but cost him everything he loved. What he didn't know was that his sacrifice would be seen as the ultimate betrayal. The plan formed in Roberto's mind over several sleepless nights. If he stayed and fought the cancer, his family would spend the next 2 years watching him die while going to crushing debt. Sophia would have to abandon her college dreams to help support the family. Miguel would grow up in the shadow of his father's death. Marina would exhaust herself caring for him while trying to keep their household together. But if he left, if he simply disappeared from their lives, they would be free to build a future without the burden of his illness. His life insurance policy had a suicide clause, but if he simply vanished, the policy would eventually pay out, giving his family the financial security they needed. It was the most selfless and selfish decision imaginable. Selfless because it would spare his family years of suffering and financial ruin. Selfish because it would allow him to die alone, without having to see the pain in his children's eyes as cancer destroyed him. Roberto spent weeks planning his disappearance. He secretly met with a lawyer to ensure his life insurance policy would eventually benefit his family. He researched hospice care in distant cities where he could die anonymously. He wrote letters to Sophia and Miguel to be open on their wedding days, explaining his choice and expressing his love. On March 3rd, 2009, Roberto made his final preparations. He kissed Sophia and Miguel goodbye as they left for school, hugged Marina as she headed to work, and sat down at the kitchen table to write the note that would end his family's happiness but preserve their future. "I can't do this anymore. I need to find who I really am." The words were deliberately cruel, designed to make his family hate him rather than mourn him. If they thought he had abandoned them for selfish reasons, they would move on with anger instead of grief. They would rebuild their lives instead of spending years wondering what they could have done differently. Roberto left the note on the kitchen table, took nothing but the clothes on his back and enough cash to get out of town, and walked away from everything he had ever loved. Roberto's plan to protect his family from grief had backfired catastrophically. Instead of saving them from pain, his abandonment had created wounds that would fester for 15 years. But the worst part was that he was still alive to see the damage he had caused. What Roberto hadn't anticipated was that cancer, even aggressive cancer, doesn't follow predictable timelines. The experimental treatment he received at a charity hospital in Phoenix, paid for by selling everything he owned, proved more effective than anyone had expected. The cancer went into remission after 18 months of brutal chemotherapy. Roberto had sacrificed his family to spare them from watching him die. But he didn't die. He lived, alone and broken, in a studio apartment 800 miles from home, surviving on disability payments and part-time work when his health allowed. For 15 years, Roberto watched his family's life unfold from a distance through social media and occasional reports from mutual friends. He saw Sophia graduate summa cum laude from law school, watched Miguel win teaching awards, Witness Marina become one of the most respected nurse practitioners in the city. They had thrived without him, exactly as he had hoped, but they had also hardened into a fortress of resentment and pain that had no room for forgiveness, even if Roberto had been brave enough to ask for it. Marina never remarried, though she had opportunities. "I don't trust my judgment in men," she would tell friends who encouraged her to date. "I thought I knew Roberto completely, and he walked out like I meant nothing to him." Sophia became a fierce advocate for abandoned children in her legal career, channeling her father wounds into professional passion. But she struggled with relationships, unable to trust that men wouldn't eventually leave. Miguel, the sweet boy who had adored his father, grew into a man who flinched whenever he heard the word dad. He was beloved by his students, but he had built walls around his heart that seemed impenetrable. Roberto's sacrifice had given his family financial stability and career success, but had also given them deep emotional scars that shaped every relationship they would ever have. And through it all, Roberto's father Eduardo watched his son's family struggle with abandonment, while his son lived alone in exile, dying slowly from isolation rather than cancer. Eduardo Mendoza had been watching his broken family for 15 years, and he had discovered the truth about his son's disappearance. Now, on his deathbed, he was about to force a reckoning that would either heal his family forever or destroy them completely. Eduardo Mendoza was not the kind of man who accepted mysteries. When his son disappeared, leaving behind a wife and children he clearly adored, Eduardo had hired private investigators to find the truth. It had taken them 3 years, but they finally located Roberto in Phoenix and uncovered the medical records that explained everything. For 12 years, Eduardo had known that his son was alive, sick and alone. He had known about the cancer, about the sacrifice, about the terrible choice Roberto had made to protect his family from his dying. And Eduardo had been faced with his own impossible choice: respect his son's decision to remain dead to his family, or reveal the truth that would upend everyone's carefully reconstructed lives. Eduardo had chosen silence, but not inaction. For 15 years, he had been Roberto's secret guardian angel, anonymously paying for his medical care, ensuring he had adequate housing and food, monitoring his health through carefully placed contacts. And Eduardo had been planning for this moment. The reading of his will, when the truth would finally come out and his family would have to decide whether love could overcome 15 years of justified anger. The will Eduardo left behind was more than a document distributing assets. It was a master plan for forced reconciliation, a final gamble by an old man who refused to let his family remain broken by a secret that had caused enough pain. Dr. Santos cleared his throat and began reading the portion of the will that would change everything. "To my son Roberto, who sacrificed everything to spare his family from watching him die, and who has lived in exile for 15 years believing he was protecting them, I leave $800,000 and my forgiveness for a choice that was both noble and devastating." The room erupted. Marina gasped. Sophia jumped to her feet, and Miguel sat frozen in disbelief. "What does that mean?" Marina demanded. "Roberto is here for money, not because he's been protecting us." Dr. Santos held up his hand. "There's more, much more." Eduardo's was about to reveal a truth so devastating that it would rewrite 15 years of family history. Roberto hadn't abandoned them. He had been dying alone to save them from unbearable pain. But the question now was whether love could survive the revelation of such a monumental lie. Dr. Santos continued reading. "To my daughter-in-law Marina, who raised 2 exceptional children alone and never stopped loving a man she had every right to hate, I leave proof that love sometimes wears the mask of abandonment." He pulled out a thick envelope. "Marina, your husband asked me to give this to you only after his death or mine, whichever came first. These are his medical records from 2009, documenting his leukemia diagnosis, and letters he wrote to each of you explaining his choice." Marina's hands shook as she took the envelope. Inside were 15 years of documentation. Medical bills Eduardo had secretly paid, progress reports on Roberto's treatment, and letters Roberto had written but never sent. Letters to Sophia about her law school graduation, to Miguel about his teaching career, to Marina about how proud he was of the woman she had become. "To my granddaughter Sophia," Dr. Santos continued, who became a fierce advocate for justice because she believed she had been abandoned unjustly. I leave the knowledge that your father's greatest act of love was walking away when staying would have destroyed your dreams. Sophia was crying now, the angry tears of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling. This isn't possible. He left us. He chose to leave us. He chose to spare you from watching him die, Roberto said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the room. The cancer had a 30% survival rate. I was supposed to be dead within 2 years. I didn't want you to spend your college fund on my chemotherapy. I didn't want Miguel to remember me as a skeleton in a hospital bed. I didn't want your mother to sacrifice her career to take care of me. So you made the decision for all of us? Marina's voice was barely controlled fury. You decided we were too weak to handle the truth? Roberto's composure finally broke. I was dying, Marina. I was 37 years old with 2 young children and a wife I loved more than my own life. And I was dying. Every choice was wrong. If I stayed, you would have watched me waste away while we went bankrupt. If I left, you would hate me, but you would survive. Dr. Santos read the final portion of Eduardo's will. To my grandson Miguel, who chose to dedicate his life to nurturing children because he believes his own father failed to nurture him, I leave the truth that your father never stopped being proud of the man you became, even though he could never tell you. Miguel, who had remained silent through the revelations, finally spoke. You've been alive for 15 years. 15 years, Dad. I graduated high school thinking you didn't care enough to stay. I became a teacher thinking I had to be the father figure I never had, and you were alive the whole time. I've been dying the whole time, Roberto replied. The cancer came back twice. I've had 4 bone marrow transplants. I've been in remission for 2 years now, but every day I wake up wondering if today is the day it comes back. And every day I wanted to call you, to see you, to tell you how proud I am of who you become. The silence in the law office was deafening. 15 years of anger, resentment, and carefully constructed hatred suddenly had no foundation. The monster who had abandoned his family was revealed to be a broken man who had made an impossible choice out of love. But revelation doesn't automatically equal reconciliation. I understand why you did it, Marina said finally, her voice hollow. And I hate that I understand it. But Roberto, you stole 15 years from us. You stole your children's father. You stole my husband. You made that choice alone, and we've all paid the price. Sophia was struggling to process years of therapy and anger management that had been built on the foundation of abandonment. Dad, I spent my entire adult life believing that people leave when things get hard. I've never been able to trust anyone because my own father walked away. And now you're telling me you left because you loved us too much. Miguel's response was the most devastating. I don't know you anymore, Dad. I was 5 when you left. I'm 20 now. I built my entire identity around being someone you could never hurt again. I don't know how to have a father at 20 years old. Roberto absorbed their pain like physical blows. This was the moment he had feared for 15 years. Not his own death, but the moment when his family would learn the truth and realize that while his motives were pure, the damage he had caused was real and lasting. I don't expect forgiveness, Roberto said quietly. I don't even deserve it. I made a choice that seemed right at the time, and I've lived with the consequences every day since. But I want you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did, and living without you has been the worst punishment I could have imagined. Dr. Santos cleared his throat. There's one more provision in Eduardo's will. He's left instructions for family counseling sessions, paid for by the estate, if all 4 of you are willing to participate. He wrote that healing is a choice, and he hoped his family would choose to heal together rather than remain broken apart. The offer hung in the air like a bridge across 15 years of pain. Marina looked at her children. Sophia, brilliant and wounded. Miguel, compassionate but guarded. And then at Roberto, the man she had loved completely and hated thoroughly for half her adult life. I can't promise forgiveness, she said finally. I can't promise that we can ever be a family again. But I can promise to try to understand, for the sake of the children we were and the people we've become. Sophia wiped her tears and straightened her shoulders, the lawyer in her taking control. We'll need ground rules. Complete honesty. No more secrets. No more unilateral decisions. If we're going to try to heal this, we do it together. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, then looked at his father with eyes that held both the 5-year-old boy who had been abandoned and the 20-year-old man who had learned to live without a father. I want to try, Dad, but I need you to understand that you can't just come back and expect to pick up where we left off. You have to earn your place in our lives. You have to prove that you've learned something from 15 years of making choices for other people. Roberto nodded, tears streaming down his face. I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes, for as long as it takes. As they left the law office that day, the Mendoza family was not restored, but for the first time in 15 years, they were whole. For people carrying 15 years of pain and love and regret, but willing to walk forward together towards something that might eventually become healing. Eduardo's final gift to his family was not the inheritance money. It was the truth that love sometimes makes terrible choices, that protection can become its own form of abandonment, and that healing is possible even when forgiveness feels impossible. 6 months later, Roberto moved back to the same city as his family, not to the same house. That bridge would take much longer to rebuild, but close enough to attend Miguel's college graduation, to witness Sophia's first major court case, to have coffee with Marina on Sundays, and slowly rebuild a friendship that had once been the foundation of their love. The cancer returned 18 months later, but this time Roberto faced it with his family by his side. And when he died, 3 years after the will reading that changed everything, he died knowing that his children understood why he had left and that Marina had found her way back to loving the man who had never stopped loving her, even when love looked like abandonment.